The theme of misjudgment and hidden depths has always been one of the most captivating elements in storytelling because it touches something universal in human experience. People often fall into the trap of making quick assumptions about others, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes deliberately, based on the most superficial markers they see. In the story of the female billionaire CEO at the dinner, this theme becomes particularly rich because the misjudgment operates on multiple layers. It is not just about gender, but also about power, social expectations, and how wealth and influence do not always shield someone from prejudice. The guests at the dinner, people who pride themselves on being sophisticated, worldly, and educated, reveal through their actions and words how easily they underestimate someone who does not fit into their narrow view of authority. This billionaire woman, despite her accomplishments, is not seen for the depth of her intelligence or the weight of her experience. Instead, she is treated as an anomaly, someone whose wealth is viewed as a fluke, perhaps inherited or gained by manipulation, rather than as the outcome of vision, strategy, and relentless effort. When we examine how misjudgment operates in such settings, it often starts with the silent but powerful influence of stereotypes. Many of the men and women at the table are likely used to seeing billionaire CEOs portrayed in media, and most often that image is a sharply dressed white male in his late 50s or 60s, someone with a commanding voice and a history of traditional corporate dominance. A young or middle-aged woman in that role, particularly one who commands her space without feeling the need to impress, stands out as something almost alien to them. Instead of embracing this as a sign that the world is changing, they recoil inwardly, questioning her legitimacy. They may smile politely, but in their tone, in their small talk, in the kinds of questions they ask her, their disbelief shows. They look for ways to explain her presence that make sense to their old assumptions. Perhaps she had family money. Perhaps she was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. Perhaps she had a man behind her, quietly doing the work. All these doubts hover invisibly over the table, creating an atmosphere where her words are listened to, but not absorbed with the seriousness they deserve. This dynamic of dismissal is not unfamiliar to many women who have had to work twice as hard for recognition in industries dominated by men. What is striking in the context of the dinner, however, is that wealth and prestige do not erase it. Even when one has already made it, by every external measure of success, even when the numbers on paper prove undeniable achievement, the skepticism persists. It reveals how deep-seated the bias runs, how much of it is tied not to rational evaluation but to unconscious frameworks people use to understand authority. For the guests, the billionaire woman sitting among them was almost a puzzle they could not solve, and rather than confront their own limited perspective, they resorted to belittling her with faint praise and condescending questions. The hidden depths in this theme come from the fact that people are never what they appear to be on the surface, yet human beings consistently forget this. We categorize, label, and draw boundaries because it makes the world easier to manage. When someone disrupts that system, it exposes our intellectual laziness. The female CEO does not bother to justify herself or to perform for their validation. Instead, she holds her space with a calmness that some may interpret as aloofness. The very composure with which she moves through the evening unsettles them further, because they expect either an over-eager attempt to prove herself or a vulnerability they can exploit. Instead, what they face is quiet confidence, a confidence born of someone who knows her own worth and does not need the affirmation of a dinner party to confirm it. That stillness itself is a kind of hidden depth, though the guests do not yet realize it. Adding another dimension to the theme is the presence of the black waitress, who embodies an even sharper version of being misjudged. For the guests, she is almost invisible, existing to refill their glasses and clear their plates. They notice her only when they need something, and even then, often without real acknowledgement. In their eyes, her role is service, and her identity is fixed by her uniform and her position. What they do not see is that every person carries a wealth of knowledge, experience, and inner life that cannot be read from their role in a given moment. The waitress, in fact, is the keeper of a hidden depth that is about to shatter the pretensions of the entire gathering. But until that moment arrives, she remains underestimated in the same way the billionaire woman is, though for different reasons. Both are trapped by the expectations projected onto them, one because she is a woman in a place of power, the other because she is a black woman in a place of service. The beauty of the theme is in how the revelation emerges. When the waitress speaks Japanese fluently, she unveils not only her own hidden depths but also highlights the arrogance of the dinner guests who assumed they were the most cultured, the most worldly people in the room. This act reframes the entire evening. Suddenly, The billionaire's quietness takes on new meaning, because someone else has validated the broader world she belongs to, a world of cross-cultural experiences, of global thinking, of skills that transcend the shallow categories the guests use to measure importance. The waitress's Japanese is not just a linguistic surprise, it is a disruption of the hierarchy. It is a reminder that intelligence, culture, and capacity are not monopolized by those who sit at the top of the table. They can exist in the places you least expect, waiting for a moment to surface. The interplay between the billionaire woman and the waitress creates a mirror effect. Both have been misjudged, though one holds immense power and wealth while the other holds none in that context. Their shared experience exposes how bias operates across different levels of society. The billionaire is doubted because her gender clashes with the expected image of power. The waitress is dismissed because her race and job clash with the expected image of cultural or intellectual sophistication. Yet both of them embody hidden depths that eventually converge, creating a moment where the guests are forced to confront their blindness. The misjudgment, then, is not just about individuals but about the entire system of assumptions that structures the way people see others. In literary and symbolic terms, the dinner table becomes a stage where the drama of prejudice and revelation plays out. The guests, wrapped in their self-assurance, represent the inertia of old ways of thinking. The billionaire, silently enduring their patronizing behavior, represents the change they cannot yet comprehend. The waitress, with her sudden and flawless Japanese, becomes the voice that pierces through the fog of their arrogance. Together, these dynamics illustrate why stories of hidden depths resonate so powerfully. They remind us that the world is richer and more complex than our first impressions, and that those who seem underestimated often carry the greatest surprises. To dive even deeper, we can also think about how misjudgment strips individuals of their humanity. When the guests doubt the billionaire's legitimacy, they are essentially denying her the right to define her own story. They impose a narrative on her that makes them more comfortable. The same goes for the waitress, who is confined to the background until she forces her presence into the foreground through language. Both women must carry the burden of being seen through distorted lenses, and yet, by the end, both demonstrate that their true selves were never diminished by those judgments. The limitation was always in the eyes of the beholders, not in the reality of the women themselves. This is why the theme of hidden depths pairs so naturally with misjudgment. The surface view is almost always wrong, and only by breaking through it can we begin to encounter the truth of a person. What makes this theme so enduring is that it speaks to both caution and hope. It cautions us against the arrogance of assuming we know people at a glance. It warns us that our prejudices, no matter how subtle, blind us to the richness of the human experience. At the same time, it offers hope by suggesting that truth has a way of surfacing, often at the most unexpected moments, and that people who are underestimated have within them the power to redefine the entire narrative. The billionaire woman and the black waitress, in their own ways, both embody this truth. The turning point through language in the story is not simply about words spoken in a different tongue. It is about how language becomes a bridge between hidden truths and surface assumptions, how it dismantles arrogance in an instant, and how it reveals connections where none were thought to exist. In this particular story, the moment when the black waitress speaks fluent Japanese serves as the dramatic rupture in the dinner's rhythm, the crack in the carefully constructed facade of sophistication that the guests at the table wear like masks. It is a rupture because everything until that moment had reinforced a hierarchy, the wealthy elite seated in their privileged places, the billionaire woman being tolerated with polite suspicion, and the staff remaining invisible, treated as functionaries without depth. Language, however, interrupts this order by revealing knowledge and cultural experience where the guests assumed there was none, and by aligning the billionaire woman with someone they had dismissed even more quickly than they dismissed her. This is why the moment feels like the pulse of the story, the one act that forces everyone to reconfigure their assumptions. The power of language is often underestimated by those who only think of it as a means of communication. In truth, language is more than words, it is memory, history, identity, and belonging. Japanese in particular, when spoken flawlessly by someone who the guests assumed would have no connection to it, functions almost like a spell. The waitress is suddenly no longer part of the background, she asserts a cultural capital that none of them expected. For the billionaire woman, who perhaps has deep business ties in Japan or personal experiences connected to the language, this moment becomes one of recognition. It is as though someone in the room finally speaks in a way that acknowledges her world, not the one defined by dismissive glances and patronizing comments, but the one where she built her empire through grit and global understanding. That recognition is powerful because it tells her that she is not alone in that room, that someone else understands and affirms the importance of cross-cultural intelligence. The turning point works on several levels. First, it destabilizes the smug certainty of the guests. These were people who probably prided themselves on their cosmopolitanism, dropping names of foreign destinations, quoting half-remembered phrases from languages they barely understood, signaling sophistication without ever fully immersing themselves in another culture. For them, Japanese was exotic and difficult, something they associated with exclusivity. When the waitress speaks it effortlessly, their own performative knowledge is revealed as shallow. Suddenly, the hierarchy is inverted. The woman they barely noticed, the one who poured their wine and cleared their plates, demonstrates a skill that outruns their assumptions of superiority. The discomfort they feel in that moment is the discomfort of being exposed, of realizing that their worldview is provincial even while cloaked in wealth. Second, the language spoken reshapes the perception of the billionaire woman. Until then, her words were filtered through doubt, her presence tolerated but not embraced. When the waitress addresses her in Japanese, the guests see, perhaps for the first time, the full measure of her identity. They realize she is not merely a woman in a position of power, she is a global figure whose influence stretches into cultural and linguistic spaces beyond their comprehension. In other words, the language not only validates the waitress's hidden depths but also reframes the CEO's authority in a way that they can no longer deny. It is as if the language becomes a seal of authenticity, forcing them to confront the reality of her legitimacy. She no longer has to explain herself. The waitress's words do the work for her. Third, there is a subtler, more emotional layer to this turning point. Language is also intimacy. To hear one's language spoken in a place where it is unexpected is to feel seen. The billionaire, who had endured the silent scrutiny of the evening, likely feels a rush of relief in that moment. The sound of Japanese is not just communication, it is solidarity. It creates a thread between her and the waitress, one that bypasses the stifling atmosphere of judgment in the room. This intimacy is not necessarily personal, it does not mean they know each other or share histories, but it is real because it acknowledges the unseen parts of each woman's life. It shows that the world is wide, that the categories imposed on them by the guests are meaningless compared to the richness of their lived experiences. This turning point also demonstrates the irony of power. The guests who thought they controlled the narrative of the evening suddenly lose that control, and it is not taken from them by force or confrontation, but by the simple act of speaking. A language they did not expect becomes the instrument of disruption, and they are left exposed. Their wealth, their social standing, their smug superiority, none of it shields them from the embarrassment of realizing they were wrong. This irony underscores the fragility of constructed hierarchies. The moment someone steps outside of the expected script, the whole play collapses. The waitress, by doing something as natural to her as speaking a language she knows, dismantles the illusion of superiority that the dinner guests had maintained. It is a reminder that power is not only about money or status but also about knowledge, perspective, and the ability to cross boundaries that others cannot. The scene also forces us to think about how language reshapes belonging. Before the turning point, the billionaire woman did not belong fully at the table. She was tolerated, doubted, sometimes condescended to, but never embraced. After the waitress speaks Japanese, belonging is redefined. The shared language creates an invisible bond that cuts across wealth and class, aligning the billionaire with the waitress and alienating the guests, who suddenly find themselves on the outside of that exchange. The irony is sharp. Those who believed themselves to be insiders, masters of the room, become outsiders in an instant, while those they excluded find kinship and validation. This shift underscores how fragile belonging is when it rests on shallow criteria like wealth or appearance, and how strong it becomes when it is rooted in genuine understanding. Another important dimension is how the moment reclaims voice. The billionaire had been silenced in subtle ways, her authority muted by constant skepticism. The waitress, too, had been voiceless in the sense that her presence was not acknowledged beyond her function. By speaking Japanese, the waitress not only claims her own voice but amplifies the CEO's voice. Together, they cut through the noise of false assumptions and force the room to listen differently. It is not that the billionaire suddenly changes who she is or gains new power, rather, the language disrupts the filter through which the guests had been hearing her all along. They are no longer able to dismiss her without also dismissing the shocking evidence of the waitress's intelligence. The turning point, then, is not only linguistic but also deeply symbolic. It represents the reclamation of voice for those who had been denied it. In a broader sense, This turning point highlights how cultural knowledge disrupts traditional hierarchies. In many elite spaces, money is the currency of value, but in this case, knowledge of language becomes the currency that holds the most weight. The guests may have millions, even billions, but in that moment, they are impoverished because they lack the cultural depth to understand what has just unfolded without embarrassment. The billionaire and the waitress, in contrast, stand enriched, not only because they understand each other but because they reveal the limits of wealth when it is not accompanied by genuine knowledge. This inversion challenges the entire structure of how value is measured in such gatherings, and it forces the guests to reevaluate themselves. The turning point through language also gestures toward a broader truth about human connection. People may come from vastly different worlds, different races, different classes, different professional roles, but the ability to speak and understand a language creates an instant bridge that defies those separations. In this story, that bridge is unexpected, almost miraculous, because it comes from someone the guests had dismissed entirely. It demonstrates how the barriers humans create, barriers of class, gender, and race, are fragile when confronted with the universality of shared knowledge. The waitress's Japanese is not only a skill but a revelation that the world is interconnected in ways the guests had never considered. It dismantles their illusion of control and reminds them that true sophistication lies in humility, in recognizing that the person you overlook may hold the key to an entire world you cannot access.